Alright guys, so I know this video is running a little bit longer, but I promise if you watch the whole thing, you will walk away a much better Legends of Runeterra tournament player. In this video, we're going to be discussing basically the fundamentals of what makes a tournament deck different from a ladder deck, how you should be approaching the idea of constructing a tournament lineup, what kinds of decks should you bring with other kinds of decks, and, you know, really why that is. At the end, I'll be talking about specific decks for this seasonal. That's going to be, you know, seasonal number 3, but this video is meant to apply broadly to kind of like any tournament format in Runeterra moving forward. So something that I get pretty commonly on Discord, usually around this time in the seasonal, like the week before the seasonal qualifiers, people will message me on Discord saying, you know, Swim, I know you've won several Runeterra tournaments in the past. What's your secret? You know, can you give me some tips about like how to build a lineup, you know, how to do that kind of thing, even though I haven't played in tournaments in a while, but I used to. And I think it's pretty beneficial knowing how tournaments in Runeterra work. Tournaments are a lot of fun. A lot of people feel like tournaments are kind of like a whole thing, and you do need to learn how they play differently. But now that seasonal is implemented into the in-game client, and there's something pretty much anyone can try if you want to put in the time, and to some people they're a lot more fun than playing on ladder. This is because there's a lot more creativity in the idea of deck tweaking and lineup constructing, and I'll go in depth about that. And there's just, you know, a lot more of a balanced meta in general because of the ability to ban certain decks. And even if you just want to watch the tournament broadcast, understanding how lineup construction works and like what the strategies behind that are will help to appreciate what really good lineups are, or, you know, really good decisions in the banning phase. So whether you're looking to get into tournaments for just the first time, or whether you are looking to expand your tournament knowledge that you already have, this is going to be the video for you. And you guys might ask, well, why should I learn to build my own lineup when I can just net deck a lineup? And the thing about this, and I'll get into this very in depth later, is that so much of tournament lineup construction is finding out what works for you personally with your specific decks that you're very comfortable playing and decks that you're not really comfortable playing and you need to swap them out for other things. So it's actually a really important skill to be able to build the lineup yourself and tailor it to your own needs. And the last 2 times I made videos sort of similar to this, I got messages on Discord from people saying, Swim, I just made it into the top 32 because of your video. I'm so excited. You know, thank you very much. And honestly, it's stuff like that that made me want to do this kind of like follow-up. This is meant to be the ultimate future-proof long-term tournament guide. So we'll be starting with basic lineup strategy, talking about stuff like matchup tables, how conquest works. Then I'm going to be talking about how to build a lineup, followed by actually doing an example build of a lineup and walking you guys through it. Then I'll be talking about how to actually play the games themselves. Honestly, this is mostly going to be focused on just mental endurance, because spoiler alert, when two people are playing each other after having played literally 8+ hours of tournament prior to that, the person who has optimized more for mental endurance will win. Straight up at that point. It, like, the last couple of rounds of a 9-hour Swiss are just who has more endurance. And then after that, at the end, I'll be talking about specific example lineups for this specific seasonal at time of recording. And I've actually been preparing quite a bit for this seasonal. That's going to sound weird to you guys, because some of you guys know I'm not playing in this and I'm casting it instead. But for me personally as a caster, I want to be very thorough. My philosophy is I will always treat casting a tournament the same as if I was playing in it. Like, I will prepare for a tournament the same exact way. I'll know exactly what deck, what lineup I would bring, all the matchups, so that I can do a good cast. And this is the kind of lineups that I'm going to be giving you guys at the end. Lastly, I'm going to be doing a seasonal qualies watch party on my Twitch channel, the same as we do every seasonal, and these are a lot of fun, so stop by and hang out. It'll be this Saturday. It'll be starting at my normal stream time in the morning in America, which means, you know, I mean, I'm going to be completely real with you. I don't even know what time these things start. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and get into how tournament decks differ from ladder decks and basic lineup strategy. So the first principle to understand is that in a Runeterra tournament format, Conquest, the winning deck is out and the losing deck has to play again. What this means is it's fundamentally a weakest link format. So you want to create a situation where your opponent can't win with a specific deck, ideally. What this means is you get an advantage when your decks have similar winning matchups, right? So for example, if one of your deck is favored against let's say Thresh, Nasus, and Azir Aurelia, random examples, then you gain a little bit of a mathematical edge if another one of your decks also has those same favorable matchups. This is something that people refer to as targeting, which is the idea of, yeah, punishing a specific deck or decks based on your lineup. And it's actually something that I think a lot of people have misconceptions about, because targeting doesn't have to be an all-in thing. A lot of people see it as like a, oh, I'm going to do a cheeky lineup where I'm not going to let X deck win and I'm going to build all my decks to punish that. And that's not really how targeting works. In reality, you're just gaining a slight mathematical advantage from positive winning matchups. Sometimes you can do soft targeting, like where you're non-committally just trying to, you know, generate the same 55% win rate across your decks, which is good. And sometimes you can do hard targeting, where you're more committally hoping that the opponent has a specific deck, but you always have other backup plans for if they don't have that deck, or it's just an insanely common deck. So I'm going to be using the word targeting to refer to just the idea of having the same positive matchup tables. It doesn't have to be a committal hard target or anything like that. This is just what targeting is, and I will say this right now, every single lineup in Runeterra in any tournament ever, any conquest tournament, should be doing this. If you're not, there's something wrong with your lineup, period. So why does this happen? It's actually pretty straightforward. If you imagine a best of 3 with, you know, 2 decks each, your opponent and you all have 50-50 decks against each other. Like my deck A is 50-50 against both decks, and deck B is 50-50 against both decks. My match win rate will obviously be 50%, right? Here's where it gets a little bit more interesting. If my deck A is 70% into both of your decks, and my deck B is 30% into both of your decks, what do you think my advantage is? Well, it actually ends up being total 58% net win rate for the match. Even though 70 and 30 should kind of feel like it's symmetrical, it's not. Because if I'm winning the same matchup more than, like, if I have a powerful matchup across my 2 decks, that's going to be a bigger advantage because your losing deck is going to have to repeat than the disadvantage that I'm getting by having both my decks being a weak matchup into one of your decks won't be as much of an advantage for you, because my losing deck, it'll have to repeat, but not against an unfavorable deck again, right? So you're literally hemorrhaging win percentage by having multiple decks that don't share similar positive matchup tables, right? You want your decks to be favored against the same things as your other decks, right? If that makes sense. Now, you can do targeting in a lot of different ways. You can do it committal or non-committal, as I said before. You can do a target on like one specific deck, or ideally, you could target a couple of different decks at once, right? Now, I'll go further and say that I think in Runeterra, you should basically always target at least multiple decks. What does this mean? It doesn't have to be anything extreme, just sometimes pick your second or your third deck with that in mind, and make sure that your decks are winning the same matchups, and that those matchups are ones you expect to see. It doesn't have to be the best deck, it doesn't have to be just one specific deck, just the general idea of making sure you're hitting 1 to 3 decks that you're favored against across the board. So now that that's out of the way, what makes a good tournament deck, right? Like, you know, you've heard people say, oh, you know, Deep is a good tournament deck, but it's not a good ladder deck and stuff like that. And it's very true, but I think a lot of people might not know exactly what that means. So there's actually a few things that can mean. Most importantly, so stuff like aggro tends to not be as good in tournaments. There are many exceptions to that. Like last seasonal was actually a pretty aggro skewed meta, but on average, the reason aggro is less good in tournaments is because it's hard to find 3 good aggro decks. Like I was saying, you really want your decks to have similar positive win rates. You want your decks to be not positive win rates, but positive matchups. You want them to be winning the same matchups. And a lot of the times you can't find 3 good aggro decks, right? Or sometimes it's just the fact that aggro decks tend to have slightly lower win rates. Usually this is made up for on ladder by just like faster games so you can climb, but in a tournament your win rate is going to matter more. Sometimes a deck being a good tournament deck can just mean that it has one specific counter, but in a tournament format, that counter is bannable, so it'll slide into a matchup. But really, when people say that so-and-so is a good tournament deck, usually what they mean is that it's got unique matchup tables. And this is where we get into the real sauce here. So this is a matchup table, and I'm actually going to be leaving this on screen for a bit while I talk, because these are really, really important. These are the start of tournament lineup construction in general. The matchup table works pretty straightforward. It's just you take the the row left to right, and that win rate on the cell there is going to be left deck's win rate into the deck at the top. So for example, if you look at Azir Aurelia, it is 56.3% win rate into Aurelion Sol, Shyvana, Zoe, right? That is that's how you can read the matchup table. And of course, what I'm showing you is the matchup table for this current meta. If you're preparing for a different tournament in the distant future, then you're going to be needing to have a matchup table that is relevant for that meta. But this is the most recent matchup table from our pubs, the Legna Meta Report, and it was actually published today, which makes it perfect for evaluating the needs of our tournament decks here. So you can see why, now that you understand it, it's all about picking decks that have good, similar matchups that are winning. You can see why the matchup table is so important. It's your bread and butter, truly. So you're gonna want to be staring at this and learning about, you know, how the different matchups work and how to select decks that complement the decks that you know you're gonna want to bring based on your own comfort level, right? There is one final thing that you guys need to keep in mind though, and this is incredibly important, which is that matchup tables tend to be fairly subjective. Stuff like win rates, you know, people will disagree about the broad ladder win rate of a deck. People will be like, I think that deck's a little bit better than its win rate. For the most part, win rate as a stat is fairly objective. Like, people won't disagree too much on like how good a deck is based on its ladder win rate, right? Matchup tables are very subjective. There's a couple of reasons for that. They have lower sample sizes by definition, and people that play specific matchups always think that their side is a bit more favorable than the other side, which makes sense, of course. If you're good at a deck, if you main a deck and you play a matchup a lot, you will know the ins and the outs, and you will have a bit of an advantage. So keep that in mind. Grain of salt. If you're looking at any matchups here and you play a certain deck a lot and you're like, well, I actually think it's kind of like this, honestly, go with that. If you play a deck a lot and you're comfortable that you can make this into a winning matchup, then there's something to be said for making sure that you're, to some degree, not to the entire degree, but to some degree, kind of sticking to your guns. If you ask a lot of top players what they think about specific matchups or matchup tables, everyone will disagree on a lot of stuff. So just keep that in mind. We are dealing with a good amount of subjectivity here. That being said, most of that subjectivity is just in the like the minor swings between like 45% win rates and 55% win rates, where people talk about, oh, I think something's slightly favored or slightly unfavored. You know, if you're looking at something like, you look at like, let's say Nasus Thresh into Aurelion Sol, which is like 38% win rate. When it's something like that, nobody's really gonna disagree that, yeah, Nasus Thresh is pretty unfavored there, right? Like, pretty much. So this is the basis of matchup construction. Now we can do a little bit of a brief meta recap. Basically, the top three dogs of this current seasonal meta are going to be Aurelia Azir, Nasus Thresh, and Trundle Lissandra Control. They form a kind of rock, paper, scissors, which is Trundle Lissandra beats Nasus Thresh, beats Aurelia Azir, beats Trundle Lissandra, right? So it goes in a cycle like that. And Ezreal Draven is also pretty good as like a fourth deck. It's unfavored against Trundle Lissandra, but favored to even against the other two. Those are probably the power decks to expect to see, but there's a couple of other spicy ones that we can talk about more in depth later. Basically, I expect Aurelia Azir and Nasus Thresh to be very, very common in the tournament. Trundle Lissandra is going to be a little bit less common, I think. And the reason for that is maybe because it's a little bit trickier to play, I guess. But mostly, I think a lot of people will be worried about Trundle Lissandra Control getting targeted. Now that we understand what targeting is, Trundle Lissandra Control has a lot of properties of fairly targetable decks, right? You can bring lineups. It's a very polarized decks, but if you're looking at this matchup table that's still on the screen, you can see that it actually has some like 3 very negative matchups just in terms of these decks. Just in terms of the literal 10 most popular decks being played in Masters right now, you can see that someone can bring Aurelia Azir, Lissandra Trundle, and Renekton Overwhelm, right? And those 3 decks will kind of smash you. Did I say Lissandra Trundle? I meant Lissandra Talia, right? The point is that it's a bit more of a vulnerable deck than some of the others, or at least a lot of players agree that it's a bit more vulnerable, and so it can be considered kind of a risky bring, because there will be some lineups where Trundle Lissandra is the deck you're trying to target, and it's more targetable than others. And that's basically the fundamental kind of like overview of tournament strategy, the meta recap in general. I'm going to add one last thing, which is, and this is why tournaments can be such like creative and rewarding experiences, which is that we don't have to go with raw power levels of decks, right? On ladder, there are such things as kind of like weak decks, stuff like tier 3 decks, but in tournaments, if it fits your lineup, if it has unique matchup tables, and those matchup tables are what you want for your lineup, given your target and given your ban, then it can be a deck that is a great idea for you to bring. Absolutely. Now, don't get like too crazy about this, right? Like, you know, I mean, don't bring like tier 4 decks, but just in general, it's good to know that you have the ability to bring stuff that would normally be a little awkward on ladder. And this is where we see stuff like Deep, right? And stuff like Lissandra Talia Thralls. These, and by the way, some of you guys might remember, I was saying a while ago, Lissandra Talia Thralls would surprise people as a tournament deck. And that probably sounded really weird to say at the time, if you remember that. But this long explanation is basically why. Because Lissandra Talia Thralls is a deck that generates very unique matchup tables that will make it find room in a tournament lineup. Absolutely. That was always going to be an inevitability. You want to come down? You want to go down? Okay. There you go. There you go. All right. So, how do you actually construct a lineup? So, how do you actually construct a lineup? Well, this is a very, very important step-by-step process, and we're going to be breaking it down here. I'm going to be using examples from this meta, but of course, just fill in your examples if you're watching in the future. It'll still, all the fundamentals still apply. So you always want your lineup to be built around two things. The first of which are your targets, which we talked about before, which matchups you're targeting, which decks you're targeting. And the second thing is your ban, and that's most important. You want to be building your lineup in a way where your ban is complementing your decks. You're showing up your deck's weaknesses with the single ban, while compounding your deck's strengths with your target or multi-target, which is exactly why you want a lineup that has kind of homogenized or similar sorts of matchups. You want your decks to be weak against the same thing so that you can ban that thing, and strong against multiple things so that, you know, you're gaining those advantageous win rates. To be perfectly honest, I think it is almost always proper to go for a double target in Runeterra, which means you should be singling out two different decks that your lineup is going to be across the board slightly favored against. It doesn't have to be extreme. You're still gaining a bit of an edge, even if your decks are like 53% and 56% against one specific deck. You're still gaining a bit of an edge, and that's important. So, step one, the comfort fill. First, you have to start with your comfort zone, and this is why it is impossible for someone else to build your lineup for you, and this is why this video is going to be really helpful to you guys, because you are going to need to build it around what decks you're comfortable on. Map out the decks that you're most comfortable on and semi-comfortable on, and you're going to have that as a starting point to build your lineup around. Comfort is incredibly important. One of the literal most common mistakes, probably the most common mistake I see people make in tournaments, is kind of overestimating their ability to learn a new deck really quick. At the end of the day, I mean, as much as we like to break decks into tiers and be like, oh, this is an OP deck, and oh, this deck's tier 2, at the end of the day, a deck that you are very comfortable playing, you know its matchups, you know how to play each matchup, and you've played that deck a lot, is going to have more of an advantage than anything else, period. So do not play a deck if you're not comfortable on that deck. Straight up. There's some decks that are pretty easy to learn, don't get me wrong. There are some decks that are like, oh yeah, no, I can just play that. It's pretty similar to this thing I already play. Or it's kind of like the same archetype as aggro, so I can kind of pick that up. That does happen, that's totally fine, but do not play decks you are not comfortable at all with. Period. So you're going to want to start with one or two decks or general archetypes that you want to settle with, that you're like, okay, this is kind of my signature deck. This is what I'm most comfortable on. Let's build this lineup around this deck. So the second thing you're going to want to do is figure out your ban. right? And that's going to be helping you basically sometimes decide your second deck. You can look at your first deck and make sure that your second deck that you're choosing is something that wants to ban a similar thing. And I'm going to keep it, I'm going to mention again, keep in mind matchup tables. These are your best friends. You're going to want to find decks that have just the same general matchups, the same losing matchups, so that you can protect your decks all with one big ban umbrella, right? So the second step is all about smoothing out your lineup built around your comfort zone. So pick decks that work well together, that have similar positive matchup tables, and have one big ban that you'll be able to protect all of them from that ban. To varying degrees. It's not necessarily important. A lot of decks don't really have big weak points. There's nothing wrong with bringing like tier 1 or tier 0 decks that don't even really need bans to function, but in terms of, decks that you bring that will have weak points, because there's always going to be some decks you'll bring that have weak points, make sure you're protecting them with the same ban. So before we go into step 3, I'm going to basically walk you guys through the first 2 steps as an example. So let's say I really like dragons. Like, I just like roleplay the shit out of dragons. I love that stuff. I can't get off if they're not dragons, so my first deck is going to be dragons. It's what I play entirely, and I'm super comfortable on it, and it's a fine deck. I mean, it's probably something like a tier 2 deck, perfectly reasonable deck. So I start with dragons and I look at the matchup tables and I notice that, let's see what dragons are good against. Okay, so dragons are actually pretty good against Nasus Thresh, right? So here's something else I play. I play Overwhelm. Renekton said you want to Overwhelm is a deck that I also happen to play. It's in my comfort zone, and it's also good against Nasus Thresh. Let's look at this, right? And that looks like a good direction for a lineup. So what's my third deck? I want my third deck to be something that also beats Nasus Thresh, but I also need to be thinking about my ban, huh? So let's, go ahead and look at their bans. And the more I look at, how Dragons and Overwhelm, how these two rows work on the matchup tables, I'm noticing a bit of a problem. Dragons wants to ban Trundle Lissandra Control, and it wants to fight Aurelia. It's good against Aurelia. That's kind of the whole point. Overwhelm wants to do literally the opposite. Overwhelm as a deck wants to ban Azir Aurelia pretty badly, and it wants to beat Trundle Lissandra Control, right? These are actually almost incompatible decks the more I look at them. So even though at first they seem like they might do well against Nasus Thresh together, there's some deeper incompatibility here. We've got to cut Overwhelm. Let's go back to just dragons. Okay, this time let's think about, the ban. Well, dragons kind of need to ban Trundle Lissandra Control, so I should build my other decks around assuming a Trundle Lissandra Control ban. So what are other decks that are vulnerable to Trundle Lissandra Control? Well, Ezreal Draven and Thresh Nasus are going to be some high-tier options that both kind of want you to ban Trundle Lissandra Control. So, hey, that's perfect. Dragons, Ezreal Draven, and Thresh Nasus. And for me, for this example, that works for me because I play a lot of Thresh Nasus, and Ezreal Draven is a deck that I'm semi-comfortable on. I would not call myself uncomfortable on Ezreal Draven. It's not like my most skillful deck, but it's something I've played before, and I know the matchups at least basically, right? It's fine. And I have enough time. I have a couple days to prep if I want to smoothen out some things. Again, as long don't do something if you're just uncomfortable on it. If it's semi-comfortable, you can flesh that out. And the more I look at this lineup that we have of Ezreal, Draven, and Dragons, and Nasus Thresh, the more I'm actually kind of liking this lineup. I mean, just looking at the matchup tables, we are a bit favored into Nasus Thresh overall, just like across the entire lineup, because of course, Dragons is favored into Nasus Thresh, Ezreal Draven is slightly favored into Nasus Thresh, and Nasus Thresh is even against Nasus Thresh. Hey, that's fine. It's still a soft target. You would call this a very soft target, don't get me wrong, but we know what our lineup is trying to accomplish, and our decks are all fighting together for that same thing, right? You are still gaining value out of a soft target like this, even though Dragons is kind of the only majorly favorable matchup we have against Nasus Thresh. Totally okay. Then we've got, Azir Aurelia is also kind of a soft target, right? That one we're a little bit more favorable into than Thresh Nasus even. So look at this. This is actually kind of perfect. We have a lineup that has one cohesive ban. We're banning Trundle Lissandra Control, and that's going to help all three of our decks. And we're double targeting. It's okay that, our targets aren't super major. They're like slightly soft, but our decks are cohesively united against the same things, and those things are pretty common things. Look at that. We have a good lineup. All right, so that is step 2. Now, you might notice there's going to be some trial and error in this. I mean, it might take a while. You'll have certain lineups that you're not sure about this third deck, and you like this idea might be really good if only there was a third deck that existed that could tie it together, stuff like that, right? So that will take a while. Sometimes you won't have matchup data on, you know, the specific win rates for the matchups that you want, and you might need to test those matchups, you know? So it's up to you exactly how thoroughly you want to take that, but deciding your lineup is very important, of course. All right, step 3, once you have your lineups, you're going to want to start tailoring them and tweaking, and this is where we get into deck teching or deck tweaking. So you've got 3 decks. Look at those 120 cards and think of some cards that you won't need anymore because of your ban. There sometimes won't be a lot. Sometimes, like, you know, depending on the decks, there will be almost no cards you change, but there will usually be at least a couple, right? And let's go to our example with this. You know, we're thinking dragons, we're banning Trundle Lysandra Control, we've got, you know, Nasus Thresh. Maybe we can cut the Rite of Negation out of our Nasus Thresh version. Maybe we can make that a 0 of, because it's not a dead card completely, don't get me wrong. It's still decent into Nasus Thresh mirrors. It's decent into Azir Aurelia for Homecoming even, but it's not amazing. Maybe if we're banning Trundle Lysandra, maybe I could cut down to a 0 of, because honestly, Nasus Thresh is a very tight deck anyway, and I might want to make that room. So that's an idea, that's an example of something that I might not need if Trundle Lysandra is being banned out. But in a case like this, we also want to look at, you know, what specifically we're targeting and how to increase our decks against those, right? So any cards we remove, we're going to be replacing with stuff that helps our target matchups. And again, in this lineup, in this example lineup, those are Azir Aurelia and Nasus Thresh. Now, there's nothing wrong with even adding a third deck to that. I mean, you can go wider on a target. It's not a bad idea. In this case, I don't think it's really feasible based on our lineups. I don't think we're going to get anything that's like, you know, great favorability, so no reason to really think about it too much. Here's something weird though. I mean, I'm noticing that, okay, we're banning Trundle Lysandra Control, and most importantly, this is interesting. I mean, we're expecting a field of these fairly aggressive decks, right? We've got Azir Aurelia and Nasus Thresh that are both pretty aggressive. We don't need that much late game, right? We don't need a ton of late game, and in addition to that, we have to be thinking about what our other bans are, because not every opponent is going to bring Trundle Lysandra Control. So when we're thinking about this lineup, against the lineup that doesn't bring Trundle Lysandra Control, what are we likely to ban? And probably the answer is like Ezreal Draven, right? If the opponent's bringing an Ezreal Draven, that's going to be fairly favored into both Dragons and Thresh Nasus. So I'm fine banning Ezreal Draven as a second deck. But hang on now, because if we're banning Ezreal Draven a decent amount of the time, if we're never expecting Trundle Lysandra Control, and if the decks that we want to be geared towards beating, the very common decks being Aurelia Azir and Thresh Nasus, we're double targeting the 2 most common decks in the tournament, I might want to make a spicier change here, because these are pretty fast decks, and I'm noticing if I'm not running into a lot of Dragon Mirrors, Aurelion Sol is actually not doing that much in these matchups, right? When I'm looking at, you know, the decks that I'm thinking about targeting, the decks that I think are going to be common, suddenly I'm thinking, okay, maybe we'll cut Aurelion Sol, maybe we'll go into a slightly faster version of the Dragons deck, running Zoe Shyvana instead, and it'll do better into the expected field, as well as it won't really be necessary, given, you know, we're not going to be facing a lot of Dragon's Mirrors. At least that's my prediction. So I might bring a deck like this, Shyvana Zoe instead of Shyvana Asol, and in this case, that would actually work pretty well. So you have to be thinking, you know, once you have your decks, you want to sort of tweak them and tailor them to both your ban as well as what you're trying to beat, right? And targeting 2 decks is good. Now, don't go too crazy. In this case, I think it's perfectly reasonable to cut Asol. I would do that. But there are going to be cases where you're tempted to cut something a little bit more core to the deck that at a certain point you can't cut things that are completely core, right? However, these are the kinds of changes you should think about making at this point in time, right? Like, you know, sometimes they can be small changes, like taking the single Rite of Negation out of Thresh Nasus. Sometimes they can be a bit more major. You know, I'm not going to completely change the entire deck after I've decided my lineup. That wouldn't really make sense. But in a case like Dragons, I might change like 5+ cards to speed the deck up to make it better into the matchups that we want it to, which, I mean, that's a pretty big change. Absolutely, these are the changes that you should be thinking about at this phase. Okay, so a couple of tips to round out this section. These are really important. So first of all, you have to ask, is a deck even targetable, right? So some decks are more targetable than others. Like I said, Trundle Lissandra Control is a very targetable deck. There are clear examples of, like, you can bring 3 different decks that all counter it pretty hard if you want to. More on that later about whether that would actually be a good idea or not. The thing is, though, not every deck is like that. Like, if you look at Azir Aurelia, there's not that many decks that can actually gain enough of an advantage against Azir Aurelia. Sure, I mean, here it shows Draven Ezreal, Draven Jinx, and Nasus Thresh are all pretty favored, but it's not necessarily as favored as you'd like for the power levels of those decks. And also, you'll notice I actually can't bring all 3 of those decks because 2 of them are using Draven P and Z. So it gets a lot harder to actually find a way to target it. Now, you can definitely engineer a lineup that's favorable into Azir Aurelia, and it would be something like triple aggro. Not like triple Smork aggro, but like Nasus Thresh and 2 aggro decks, right? Like Nasus Thresh, discard aggro, and, I don't know, Spider aggro or something like that, right? You could do something like that, and it's not bad. It's definitely an option for you to bring to this tournament if you want to target something like Azir Aurelia. I mean, almost everyone's going to be bringing Azir Aurelia. It's semi-safe to do that. The only problem is you have to ask yourself, am I getting enough of an effective win rate against this deck, right? Like, am I, like, Azir Aurelia can still steal random wins, and bringing a deck like Spiders is going to be really vulnerable into a lot of other decks. It's also a pretty committal target. You're not really double targeting, so it's a bit riskier. And this is where you get into the territory of maybe deciding that Azir Aurelia is fundamentally basically untargetable, which is to say not worth targeting. And that's what most players would agree on right now. Most top players agree that Azir Aurelia isn't really worth trying to target. Although there's definitely some contention there. There's some players that are going to go for it, and it's debatable. I mean, it's pretty close. And of course, that's a little bit different from just doing a nice non-committal target like we were talking about before with, like, you know, getting a nice 55% win rate against it across the board is something that you can do in a lineup that is doing other objectives at the same time. When it's like the primary thing your lineup is doing, that gets a little bit risky, and that's a lot harder to make a case for with Aurelia Azir. Tip number 2. You should always be asking yourself, for any decks that you're bringing that are likely to be high priority ban targets, common ban targets include Trundle Lissandra Control, Aurelia Azir, stuff like that. Basically just those 2, actually. Yeah, that's the matchup we're in. Anyway, you always have to ask yourself, if someone was to not ban this deck, what kind of lineup would they have to have? And given that, how should I tweak my deck to be less bad into that kind of targeted lineup, right? Like, for example, if you're not bringing Trundle Lissandra Control, but you are bringing Aurelia Azir, most lineups should be banning your Aurelia Azir, straight up. So what that means is you're only actually going to play it against the lineups that aren't banning it. And what that means is you might want to tech a couple of the cards to help those matchups. Like, for example, Aurelia Azir is going to be vulnerable against the aggro game plans, stuff like discard aggro and Nasus Thresh trying to target you down. And you might see a couple of those decks. And even if you don't, your Aurelia Azir is kind of going to get banned anyway. So adding 1 or 2 Navori Highwayman for as a random example into Aurelia Azir is extremely reasonable. I know it sounds weird, like, especially with like ladder brain, it's like a Navori Highwayman in Aurelia Azir. That doesn't make sense. But think about it. In this case, running like 1 or 2 Highwaymen is perfectly non-committal, and it just shores you up a little bit better against the lineups that won't ban Aurelia Azir, which are the only time you're ever going to play the deck without, you know, making you vulnerable enough that other matchups won't ban Aurelia Azir. Like, other matchups still will have to. So that kind of thing is an important consideration, right? That kind of logic of, well, this deck is only ever not going to be banned against this kind of lineup. Let's make that a harder decision for the opponent, right? And you can protect yourself against some kinds of targets in that way. That one's really counterintuitive. It's always going to look weird when you see someone rocking Aurelia Azir and they're just running like 2 Navori Highwayman. That will literally always just look strange at first until you think about it. And like, just the reality of the situation of it's only ever going to get played in those matchups just means that kind of thing can make so much more sense than it ever could on ladder, right? It's just a completely different kind of game. All right, tip number 3, don't get too cheeky in the qualifiers. So what I mean by this is in the qualies, the top 1000, you are going to have to do a little bit of meta slaving, by which I mean you will be able to, you know, play your own unique decks and play your own unique lineup, but you shouldn't really do anything super spicy, because at the end of the day, you will still see some random stuff. You're going to be seeing wilder things in the qualifiers. You're going to be seeing, like, you know, people running stuff like aggro that you can expect it won't happen in the top 32. And you do need to respect a little bit the absolute, like, ladder power level, right? The qualifiers is almost like a hybrid between, like, the top 32, but it does have some ladder tendencies. You will literally just counter some you'll encounter some ladder players that are just playing ladder things a little bit, and so it's a little bit risky to do anything super spicy for just the open qualifiers. When you get to the top 32, that's when you can start kind of building your own decks. So as a rule of thumb, I would say that the deck building cheekiness of the qualifiers should usually be limited to, like, adding in, like, tier 3 decks that suit your lineup, like running stuff like Deep or Trunda Lysandra Thralls, like, not Trunda Lysandra Thralls, sorry, Talia Lysandra Thralls or Deep, decks like that. If they fit your lineup, if they're tier 3 decks, doesn't matter, perfectly good for open qualies. For top 32, that's where instead of running like tier 3 decks that fit your lineup, you can start to kind of make your own brews that are like spicier and that really fit your lineup, and you don't have to worry about as much just random stuff flying around to interfere with the very precise nature of what your lineup is trying to do. So a little bit spicier in the top 32. Don't get too crazy in the open qualies. Now, we're going to get into the most important section here, which is actually playing the games. Now, in terms of tournament gameplay, it's not really that different from normal ladder, really. Now, the biggest thing is that you have open deck lists, right? You can see your opponent's deck list and they can see yours. What this means is you will have to be kind of like pulling up their deck list on the side, maybe on your side monitor, or tabbing out sometimes. And you will be, you know, being like, oh, they only run 2 Black Spears. They've already played 1, so I don't have to play around a second Black Spear. I might if they had 3. You know, that kind of thing is perfectly fine. And that's the kind of logic you should be employing. That's honestly pretty much the only main way that playing tournaments out from a functional level actually differs from playing ladder games, right? It's mostly the deck building that's the big thing. So what I'm going to be focusing on this section instead is just pure endurance. And I said it before and I'll say it again, but it matters so much more than you can possibly imagine when you're hyper focused for literally 9 hours. When you're in that 9th round, the player that prepared more mentally is going to win. Like literally, if you haven't experienced it, you're gonna underestimate how hard it'll hit you. I'll tell you a story. The first Swiss tournament I played in Gwent was an 11-hour Swiss tournament, and I had a great lineup and I did everything right, and I didn't optimize for mental endurance, and I just crashed and started making misplays. Like, when you hit that like 8-hour mark, you gotta be ready for it, man. So how do you actually achieve mental endurance then? Well, a lot of it is just the resets. When you're between games, especially like halfway through the day and onward, literally get up, splash your face with water, do a couple jumping jacks. I'm not joking. Like, this is actually important. This will make a difference. You wouldn't think that it does. Just trust me on this. It'll make all the difference. I would highly advise against jamming warm-up games. This is also a mistake that's very common. Don't exhaust yourself too early. A lot of people will literally make the mistake of like scrimming 2 hours before the tournament. Homie, it's a 9-hour thing. What are you doing? Like, you can do like one warm-up game if you want to get just the tiniest bit of warmed up so you're not going in like completely cold, but I really wouldn't do any more than that. Seriously, zero irony, you should consider this as a major factor when you're deciding on your deck lineup. Again, it sounds like it probably sounds weird. I'm very serious. Like, if you're deciding between like, oh, is deck 3, should my deck 3 be this deck or that deck? Like, sometimes if it's a close call, the decision maker should literally be which one is going to be more mentally exhausting. Because if you're playing like 3 decks that require a ton of thinking on a lot of common decision points, and you're literally gonna run out of brain juice at like 6 hours and you're gonna flounder. So start your day with a breakfast that is high in protein and fat. Make sure that you do a little bit of at least light exercise. There's nothing wrong with a little power walking. It's in some nice low cortisol exercise that is still going to, you know, mentally prepare you and reset you between games, especially is really, really great. Make sure that if you're eating throughout the tournament, nothing wrong with eating, but I'd recommend stuff that has, you know, carbohydrates with, you know, maybe a little bit of fiber. Fruit, for example, can be good, or some nut butter. For those of you guys who have been watching me for a long time, you guys might have observed me in early Runeterra tournaments, literally over a year ago. I would like I would literally like scoop spoonfuls of peanut butter sometimes between games. If you're going for carbs, you're definitely going to want to go for, yeah, high fiber stuff that's not going to cause you to have any sort of crash at any point. And so, yeah, stuff like apples and berries can be pretty ideal for that. Make sure you're de-stressing yourself between games. This is probably the single most important thing. Do not linger on any sort of like, oh, I misplayed, or oh, I should have won that. Like, obviously, to improve as a player, it is good spending mental energy on that, but this is not really the time to do it, right? Like, acknowledge the mistake and move on immediately. Taking deep breaths can help with that. I always hated it when I was a kid and people told me to take deep breaths because I never really understood how it worked. Turns out when you're stressed about something, it's like basically an environmental response. So like danger or predator, it spikes your cortisol. Taking deep breaths in and out, breathing out like this, triggers your parasympathetic nervous system, and you're basically controlling your body. You're telling your body that we're past it. It's time to calm down now, right? We can relax. There's no danger. There's no stress, and it's a very, very important reset. Do a little meditation. When I say meditation, it sounds like a whole thing. It doesn't have to be like a whole thing. It can be like 30 seconds of just like close your eyes, take a few deep breaths, and feel your body, and that's it. That's a nice reset between your games. And like I mentioned, splashing some water on your face is just amazing. That just works for everybody. There's nobody that won't just work for. And some people do push-ups. Push-ups are great as well, but if you're really trying to min-max, aerobic exercise like jumping jacks, or like, you know, running in place, taking a walk around your floor, or, you know, whatever, aerobic exercise is going to be a little bit better for resetting your mental. In terms of supplements, your best friends are vitamin D, the B vitamins, fish oil, caffeine, and MCT oil. In terms of energy drinks, they're totally fine. I've drank Monster on quite a few occasions when I'm playing in these tournaments, and it's a good source of, you know, giving you the B vitamins and caffeine. I would also recommend ashwagandha for long term, but that's not something that really takes effect right away, so I guess for the purposes of this video, don't worry about that. Basically, as a human being, you're throwing, if you're not taking at least vitamin D and fish oil. Like, everyone needs to be taking those, actually. All right, that's pretty much it for endurance stuff, at least on a basic level. I might do a follow-up video that's much more in depth about stuff like this in the future, but the most important thing is to just remember, you know, I mean, the mind can't control the mind. Use the mind to control the body, and that it feedbacks, you know, right into like how you control the mind, right? Like, you don't calm yourself down by thinking, calm down, calm down. You do so by controlling your body, and then that in turn makes you calm down, right? Like, that's how we work as humans. All right, and for the final section, this is going to be just purely stuff for this seasonal and this seasonal only. Basically, I'm just going to spit out some kind of like pre-constructed lineups that are good in general. Now, like I said, everyone is different. Comfort zones are ridiculously important. You should pick a lineup and tailor a lineup that works for you. But if one of these lineups happens to work pretty well for you, then, you know, go nuts. Or if you just can't be fucked to make your own, one of these will do pretty well. These are going to be kind of the most standard lineups, and you should be expecting to play against variations of these in the tournament. So one of the most standard lineups is going to be Azirelia, Nasus Thresh, and Trundle Lysandra Control, and this lineup would want to ban Irelia, because of course, you know, Irelia is favored into Trundle Lysandra Control, and also just kind of the default ban in general, by the way. Just like, if you don't know what to do, just ban Irelia. And I should also mention for this section, I won't be listing deck lists for each of these decks because that would just be way too many deck lists. But the ones that are on my site, which actually just got updated tonight, the ones on my site are going to be up to date and will be good starting points. I would recommend being open to making a couple of tweaks based on the guide that I was talking about earlier about how to tweak your lineup. Definitely do a little bit of that, but starting versions you can find on my site. Okay, the second lineup is Azir, Nasus, Ezreal, Draven, banning Trundle under control. Another pretty standard lineup. It's just like a slightly different way of doing it. In fact, you'll notice it's kind of similar to the one that we did with dragons in the example. If you wanted to try to target Azir, you could do something a little bit spicy, which in this case might look like Nasus Thresh, discard, aggro, and a third deck, which was basically another aggro deck. This would probably be either Spiders or Azir aggro, Azir Noxus aggro, both of which do pretty well into Azir overall. This lineup would ban Trundle under control, and then probably Nasus Thresh in that order. Now, if you want to target Trundle under control a little bit, something that might be pretty good is Azir, Trundle under control, and deep, banning Azir. So this is kind of a soft target, of course, because Trundle under control is going to be even in the mirror. If you want to go a little deeper on this target, a little bit riskier, but favorable into Trundle under control, another good lineup is Azir, and then Overwhelm, just Renekton Sejuani Overwhelm, and then either... I guess it would have to be deep at that point because you can't run Thralls with Overwhelm. They're the same regions. So Azir, Overwhelm, deep is a good anti-TLC lineup. And in that one, you would also ban Azir, which you guys might notice a bit of a recurring theme here. These lineups involve a lot of banning of Azir. It's a good idea. I'd recommend it. Lastly, I'm going to leave you guys with a little bit of a puzzle, actually. I don't want to spell everything out. I want these videos to make you guys into better players and better deck builders. And so I don't want to give everything to you. But something that I think would be a really good thing to think about for this tournament is maybe trying to see, and don't do anything crazy, but if you're comfortable on the kinds of decks this might entail, ask yourself what it would look like if you tried to target, it can be soft targeting, it doesn't have to go crazy, but trying to target Nasus Thresh with a deck. So for example, dragons would be good against Nasus Thresh. I think there's actually a lot of decks that are good against Nasus Thresh that a lot of people might not register as like real decks or competitive decks. Nasus Thresh is going to be a very common deck. It's looking a little bit targetable to me personally. I can say that if I was playing in this tournament myself, I would spend at least a good amount of time seriously considering bringing a lineup that targeted Nasus Thresh. I mean, without spending that time, I can't guarantee you that I would do that, but it would be worth thinking about. Because that's an option that I think not a lot of people are actually really thinking about, but I think is more doable if you get a little creative about what other decks you're going to be running. But yeah, that is it. That is the full, God, I've been recording for 2 hours. The full deck guide for, well, deck guide? No, sorry, I'm disoriented. The tournament guide. What was this? I was doing a tournament. This is for all the tournaments. This is the only guide you'll ever need. And hopefully, I really hope this has helped you guys out, because this is a really common question I get asked. Now, if you are able to, pull it through, hopefully you'll join us in the, Quali's watch party on Saturday. That stream is always a lot of fun. And hey, if you're one of the ones that makes it to the top 32, send me a Discord DM. And yeah, I'll actually happily help you prepare for the top 32, honestly. Because the last couple of times someone messaged me and was like, "Oh, Swim, thank you so much. I made it to the top 32 from your video." I literally ended up helping them with their top 32 lineup. So if you guys make it, absolutely hit me up. I would love to hear about it. And hopefully this video will end up serving you guys. I hope this understanding will change the way that you approach these tournaments and that you can be really successful here. I wanted to give you guys the tools that you needed to set out and make something yourself. I do not want to be just like handing you the deck list. I do not want to be just giving you the answers. And I think I've given you guys just enough that you will be able to, if you want to put a little bit of time into it, make something out of this. And yeah, good luck everyone, and I'll see you guys next time.